Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mythic for Developers. Today, we're going to be talking about translation containers. Now, I think translation containers is something that trips people up a bunch, especially in how translation containers compare with something like a C2 profile. The idea of a translation container is probably pretty unique to Mythic. It offers a lot of functionality, but I can see how things get kind of lost in the weeds and how all these different components are fitting together. So I want to take a moment to talk in this video about what a translation container is and how it all sort of fits together. So if we look at in the Mythic UI, we can see here we have a payload called Arachne, it's typed agent. We also have this thing here, type translation, called Arachne translator. You can always identify a translation container in the UI with this little like translation icon. All this is saying is that the Arachne agent is associated with and leveraging this translator. So if we think back to our previous videos about a C2 profile, the whole goal for a C2 profile is to be able to take a message from the agent, forward it off to Mythic, get the response back from Mythic, and send it back to the agent. The C2 profile has nothing to do with the content of the message. Instead, a translation container allows you to say that the content of the message will not be this normal JSON standard that Mythic uses. Instead, you're going to use maybe a different JSON message, or maybe you want to use a binary protocol or something else. That's where a translation container comes into play. So if we take a moment to look at how we define this in the code, then we can come back and see a diagram kind of illustrating the flow of things. So inside the code for the Arachne translator, it looks very similar to things that we've seen before. It's this same standard GitHub project. We have, our config.json and everything that we had in the payload and C2 profile examples before. So here inside of this payload type folder, we have this Arachne folder. This is the thing that actually gets copied over into the installed services folder in Mythic whenever you install this via Mythic CLI. Inside of here, though, you'll notice something a little bit different. We have Arachne, Arachne translator, and web shell all defined in here. If we look at this main.py, it doesn't have to be called main.py. If you remember, this folder structure can be whatever you want, as long as you have the Docker file and point to some sort of entry point. So inside of here, we import Mythic container. We then import Arachne, okay. We import web shell, and we're importing the translator. So all three of these things, an agent, a translation container, and a C2 profile are all being imported at once before we then call this start and run forever. So that's something that's important to call out with any of the sort of stuff that we've been doing and that we'll do going forward in other kinds of containers. Each container doesn't have to be isolated to one specific thing. You can bundle these sorts of, agent C2 profiles, eventing aspects, translators, like all sorts of stuff together and kind of make it easy for you to share code between them. They still get processed and registered as different things in the Mythic UI. Like we saw over here, we have an Arachne entry and an Arachne translator entry, but this allows us to go through and share code and keep things in an easier way to debug and process going forward. So if we look up here in our Arachne agent, inside the agent functions, we have a builder.py. The main point here being that we have a class that's a subclass of payload type, just like we saw with the payload type. The two things I want to call out down here, though, is this Mythic encrypts and translation container. So Mythic encrypts means that if we're doing some sort of encryption, whether that's like AES-256, Mythic will be the one that's responsible for doing the encryption and decryption pieces. Even if you're using a translation container, if you say Mythic encrypts is true, Mythic will handle that part for you. If you set Mythic encrypts equals false, then it's expected that your translation container is also handling whatever encryption and decryption needs to happen. To say that an agent is associated with a specific translation container, it's as easy as saying translation container equals and then the name of the translation container that you want to use. So what does the translation container look like? Well, if we come up here, we have a file, just like we had from before with payload types and C2 profiles. We import this translation base, and we make a new class that is a subclass of this translation container class. At that point, once we do that, we have that subclassing, and we import this class, now it's available to be synced over to Mythic, just like we saw with payload types and C2 profiles. These translation containers need just a couple of things. A name, this is what we see over in the UI and how agents are able to associate with it. Some description, some author, and then we have these three functions. So we have generate keys, translate from C2 format, and translate to C2 format. So if you're going through and saying that in your agent, Mythic does not handle the encryption decryption, then that means that your translation container has to be the one to handle it. At that point, if you go through and select in a C2 profile, you say, maybe I do want to use encryption and I want to use AS256. It would be up to your translation container in this function, generate keys, to generate the encryption and decryption key that's going to be used later on. As you do this for these follow-on functions, Mythic will give these keys back to you and allow you to do the encryption and decryption yourself. But if you're the one that's going to be doing it, you are the one that has to be able to generate the keys. They can be asymmetric. That's why there's a separate one for decryption and encryption. It's completely up to you. But now, say the agent is sending a message to Mythic. It's not going to be in Mythic's standard JSON format. So this translate from C2 format message, this function is called with the content of potentially decrypted, whatever the agent sent. In our case for Arachne, it's just a single string with various pieces separated by pipes. So we can then take that, split that back out, and generate the normal message that Mythic would expect. Here we have standard JSON, we have an action, in this case we have responses and the data that we want to send along. So then this is what then goes back to Mythic. Mythic processes this, determines that it needs to send a response back to the agent, and then this function, translate to C2 format, is what's called. So this is given whatever message Mythic is trying to give back to the agent and asks for your function to return whatever is needed by your agent to be able to understand what's going on. In this case, we just kind of take out a lot of the JSON pieces in the Mythic agent, just look for additional tasks and encode the parameters. So if we look at what this means, maybe from a bit more of a visual perspective, we can come over here and look at Mythic's documentation. There's a message flow folder, which if you haven't checked it out before, I highly recommend that you do because it has a lot of these nice diagrams that indicate how messages are being processed within Mythic. So if we look over here, we can see we have an agent that sends a message to a C2 profile container. That C2 profile container, remember, not worried about the content of the message, just that it gets a message in its entirety, forwards it to Mythic. Mythic starts processing. It base64 decodes it, gets that UUID out front. From that UUID, it can see, this is a message from Arachne. I know that Arachne has a translation container associated with it. So let me see what I need to do. If Arachne says that Mythic encrypts is true, Mythic will take the data after that UUID, decrypt it, and then send that to the translation container. If the Arachne said that Mythic encrypts is false, then Mythic won't do anything with that encrypted data and will just forward the whole thing off to the translation container. At that point, it'd be up to the translation container to decrypt the message and then convert it. Once we're done, we have a normal JSON message that Mythic can understand that gets sent back to Mythic. Mythic processes it like normal, handles any delegates or things that need to happen. Once it's finished, it creates the response and then determines, okay, I need this to be in a format that the agent can understand. So it sends that JSON over to the translation container. The translation container takes that message, converts it into the appropriate message format that the agent needs. And here another decision is made. If the translation container is doing the encryption and decryption, then it's up to the translation container at this point to not just convert it from JSON to your special format message, but to also encrypt it. This means potentially putting that UUID out front, base64 encoding it, making the final message that is going to get sent back. If you say that the translation container is not doing the encryption, so Mythic encrypts is true, then all you're returning here is the custom formatted message that gets sent back to Mythic. Mythic then takes that message, encrypts it, puts the UUID out front, base64 encodes it, and then that gets sent along back to the C2 profile container, and then that gets sent back to your agent. So pretty straightforward if you think about kind of where these sorts of processing aspects need to happen. Again, your C2 profile container cares nothing about the content of the message. It's simply getting message from agent, sending to Mythic, getting response from Mythic, sending back to agent. It's your translation container that's worried about the content of the message. The reason we have the translation container split out as a separate thing allows you to go through and say, I have this sweet custom binary protocol. I want to be able to use it across all of the agents I create. Since it's its own standalone thing, you can easily associate it with each agent instead of having to bundle it in into each container that you create. So it's a nice way to kind of abstract that out and identify kind of where these things belong. And again, you can identify any translation container via this little translation icon over here. It says the type is translation, and you can see who it's associated with. So hopefully that kind of illuminates some things and makes the whole process of a translation container and C2 profiles and all of that a little bit clearer. It's really powerful. It allows you to have a whole lot more customization into how your agent works. It just has a little bit overhead to be able to hook that up into Mythic.